the warning Miss Marple could not ignore. Hello friends, I'm Edward, your host for this evening. Welcome back to Warm Pages. Before we settle into tonight's story, I'd love to hear what's the weather like in your part of the world today. Tell me in the comments, I read everyone. Now make yourself comfortable and let us begin. Chapter 1. A letter, enclosed with the invitation. The second post at Danemede generally brought very little of interest. A circular from the seedsman, perhaps, or a note from the vicar's wife about the flower rota. And Miss Marple had long ago fallen into the habit of taking it up from the mat without any particular expectation. On this particular morning in early November, with the mist still lying low over the garden, and the last of the Michaelmas daisies gone brown and sodden at the stem, there were 2 envelopes, and one of them was heavier and stiffer than anything the vicarage was ever likely to produce. She turned it over before opening it, which was a habit of hers. A great deal could be told from an envelope, she always maintained, before one troubled to read a single word inside it. This one was of good cream paper, the hand upon it firm and rather flourishing, and the postmark was Somerset. Inside was a card engraved, requesting the pleasure of Miss J. Marple's company at Farrant Grange, Coldharbour, for a small gathering to celebrate the betrothal of Mr. Endymion Farrant to Miss Sylvie Pennefather. It was signed in the same confident hand as the envelope, Isadora Blythewood, and beneath the signature, in smaller and rather charming script, I do hope you will come. It would give such pleasure to an old friend of yours who is under my roof. Miss Marple read this twice. She could not, for the life of her, place Lady Blythewood with any certainty. There had been, she thought, a garden party some years ago, and a woman with a great deal of grey-blue hair who'd been extremely gracious about Miss Marple's roses. But an old friend under her roof was another matter entirely, and Miss Marple went through her acquaintance with some care before a second, smaller piece of paper slid out of the folded card and settled on the tablecloth beside the marmalade. It was a single sheet, torn rather than cut from a larger pad, and the hand upon it was nothing like the confident script of the invitation. It sloped and wavered, and in 2 places the ink had blotted where the pen had evidently paused too long. My dear Jane, if I may still call you so after all these years, though I dare say you have quite forgotten Comfort Hatch, and there is no reason you should remember her at all. I don't know how to write this without sounding a very foolish old woman, and perhaps I am one. But I have thought of you so often, and of how sensible you always were, even at school, when the rest of us were being silly about nothing at all. And I find I cannot rest until I have told someone who will not simply pat my hand and tell me I am imagining things. Something is not quite right here. I hardly like to put it more plainly than that, because when I try, it sounds like nothing at all. A paper out of place, a look I did not care for, a kindness that is not somehow quite kind. You will think me very silly. I think myself very silly several times a day. But I should be so very glad if you could come, Jane, and I do not think I shall feel easy until you do. Your affectionate old friend, Comfort Hatch. Miss Marple sat for some little while with the 2 papers side by side upon the tablecloth, the invitation and its ragged companion, and did not touch her tea, which grew in consequence entirely undrinkable. She was thinking of a small, anxious girl with a plait that always came undone, whom she had not thought of in, how long was it? 40 years, very nearly. Longer. They had gone to the same school in Eastbourne for 2 winter terms, before the Hatch family's fortunes had taken them elsewhere, and Miss Marple could remember with the peculiar clarity that old memories sometimes have when newer ones have grown vague, that Comfort Hatch had been the sort of child who apologised for things that were not her fault, and cried when other children were scolded, and had once given up her own pudding, without a word to anyone, to a girl who had been sent to bed without hers. She had not thought of her, she reflected, in 40 years. And now here was Comfort Hatch's hand, the very same nervous, apologetic hand, grown old and unsteady but otherwise quite unmistakable, begging her to come. It was, of course, very likely nothing at all. Elderly companions, for that was plainly what poor Comfort had become, tucked away as an old friend under my roof, which was Lady Blythewood's gracious way of putting it, were prone to fancies. They led quiet lives among other people's concerns, and a certain nervous imagination was, Miss Marple knew very well, one of the recognised hazards of the position. She had known one or two such ladies in her time, and had learned to receive their alarms with sympathy and a proper degree of reserve. And yet— "You're very quiet this morning, Jane," said Mrs. Bantry, who had come round after breakfast on the pretext of borrowing a pattern for a jumper, and had, in fact, come to complain at length about the new gardener's opinions on delphiniums. "What is it? Not bad news, I hope?" "I don't quite know what it is," said Miss Marple. "That is rather the trouble." She handed over both papers and watched Dolly Bantry's eyebrows go up as she read the invitation, and further up still as she read the note that had come with it. "Well," said Mrs. Bantry, when she had finished, "what a peculiar sort of letter. Who on earth is Comfort Hatch? An old schoolfellow of mine. I have not seen her, or thought of her, in something like 40 years. And she writes to you now, out of a clear sky, really, Jane, sounding quite frightened, and encloses it in an invitation from a woman you scarcely know." "That is exactly it," said Miss Marple. "It is not the sort of letter one writes about a paper out of place, or a look one did not care for. Those are the words she has chosen, because they are the only words she has. But something has frightened her very much, I think, and she does not know how to say what it is. Perhaps because she does not properly know herself." Mrs. Bantry read the note through a second time, her lips moving very slightly over certain phrases, in the manner of a woman who suspects there is more to be got out of a thing if only she looks at it long enough. "She writes like someone who has been taught not to make a fuss," she said at last. "I know the sort. Poor Aunt Selina had a companion just such a one, always apologising for the weather, as if she'd personally arranged it to be inconvenient. And do you know, Jane, when the poor creature finally did complain about something, it was the damp in her bedroom, nothing more alarming than that. It turned out she'd been putting up with a positively dangerous chimney for the better part of 2 years, because she didn't like to be a trouble." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "that is rather what I was thinking. People who have learned not to make a fuss are not always wrong to be alarmed when at last they do. Quite the reverse, I have generally found. It takes them so very much longer to arrive at the fuss in the first place, that by the time they do, there is usually something in it." "You'll go, of course," said Mrs. Bantry, in the tone of one stating an established fact rather than asking a question. "I don't quite see how I can refuse," said Miss Marple, a little apologetically, as though travelling to Somerset in November were a mild social inconvenience rather than anything more. "One does hear, you know, of old ladies who imagine burglars under the bed, and are perfectly right to have imagined them. I should never forgive myself if I did nothing, and it turned out that there really was something under the bed, so to speak." "You make it sound very alarming." "I don't mean to. It is probably nothing whatever. A companion's life is not always a happy one, and unhappiness does make people fanciful." Miss Marple folded Comfort Hatch's letter along its original crease, with the particular care one gives to something fragile. "But I find I cannot simply put it in a drawer and forget about it, Dolly, and I don't think I should try. There is a difference, you know, between a fancy and a fear, even when they use very much the same words. I believe this is a fear." Mrs. Bantry, who had known Miss Marple long enough to recognise when a decision had, in all but the formal sense, already been made, contented herself with asking a number of practical questions. Was it a comfortable house? Did Miss Marple know anyone else who was to be there? Would she want the loan of a fur? None of which Miss Marple could answer with any confidence, since she knew almost nothing beyond what the invitation itself declared. A small gathering, a betrothal, a Lady Blythewood who wrote a confident hand and signed herself with evident charm. It was, all things considered, a very ordinary invitation, of the kind that arrived at Danemead perhaps 2 or 3 times in a good year, and Miss Marple told herself so several times over the course of that day, quite as though she expected by sheer repetition to believe it. She got out her better coat and examined it for moth. She consulted the railway timetable and worked out, not without a certain private satisfaction in the exercise, the best combination of trains that would bring her to the small station nearest Coldharbour by the Thursday afternoon the invitation specified. She wrote her acceptance in her own neat hand, and then, on a fresh sheet, began a private letter to Comfort Hatch herself. My dear Comfort, what a very great surprise, and what a pleasure it will be to see you again after so long. And found, rereading it before she sealed it, that she had also written, I shall be with you on Thursday, and you must not feel you have to explain anything to me all at once. We will find a quiet corner, and you shall tell me whatever you wish in your own time. She looked at that sentence for some while before she let it stand. There was, she thought, folding both letters and reaching for the stamps, a particular kind of unease that a sensible woman does not put into words even to her oldest friends, because she's a little ashamed of taking it seriously and a little afraid that she is right to. Comfort Hatch had written such a letter. Miss Marple had read a great many letters in her life, some anxious, some merely dull, one or two, over the years, that had turned out to matter a very great deal more than anyone at the time had supposed, and she did not think she was mistaken now. She posted both letters that afternoon on her way to the vicarage, and said nothing more about the matter to anyone, though she thought a good deal over the following days about a small girl with an undone plait, and a pudding given up without complaint to someone who had done nothing to deserve the loss of her own. There was packing to be done, of course, and she gave it the same unhurried, methodical attention she gave everything. The better coat, after all, examined and found sound. 2 of her plainer dresses, suitable for a house where she knew no one and could not judge, from one gracious signature on a card, quite what would be expected of her. Her knitting, naturally, and a sufficiency of wool, since one never knew how long a visit of this kind might, in the end, extend itself. She packed, too, a small photograph, taken so long ago that the faces in it had gone soft. Chapter 2. The Household at Farrant Grange. The train, which had been perfectly punctual as far as Taunton, grew steadily less confident of itself thereafter, so that it was very nearly dark, a damp, early November sort of dark, with the fog coming up off the low fields like something breathed out rather than fallen. By the time Miss Marple was set down at the small station serving Coldharbour, with her case, her knitting bag, and a sense that she had travelled a very great deal further than the map would strictly allow, a car had been sent. The chauffeur, a taciturn man who volunteered nothing beyond the information that it was a nasty night for it, drove her the 2 miles to the Grange along lanes so thickly hedged that the headlamps seemed to open up a tunnel through the fog rather than a road, and it was with some relief that Miss Marple saw at last a long, low frontage of grey stone emerge out of the murk, its windows lit a warm and welcoming yellow against the general dampness of the evening. Farrant Grange, on closer inspection, proved to be the sort of house that had clearly been added to by several generations, with several different opinions about what a house ought to look like, and had somehow in the process arrived at a kind of comfortable dignity that no single architect could have planned. A fire was burning in the hall. Miss Marple, coming in out of the cold with a nose rather pink and her gloves rather damp, thought it looked exactly what a country house ought to look like on a November evening, and was inclined, for a moment, to feel that she had been foolish to come at all. The sort of foolish that comes of taking an old friend's nerves too seriously. The feeling did not survive her hostess. Miss Marple, how very good of you to come such a distance, and in such weather too. Lady Blythewood came across the hall with both hands outstretched, a tall woman, handsomely got up in dove grey, with a great deal of soft, becomingly untidy grey hair, and the particular warmth of manner that makes a stranger feel, within 30 seconds, that she's been an intimate friend of the house for years. I do hope the fog wasn't perfectly dreadful. We're all so looking forward to having you. Comfort has talked of nothing else since your letter came, has she not, Endymion? Talked our ears quite off, in fact, said the young man thus appealed to, coming forward with the easy, unhurried charm of someone who has never in his life doubted that a room would be glad to see him. He was fair, good-looking in the unremarkable way of a great many pleasant young men, and shook Miss Marple's hand with rather more warmth than the brief acquaintance strictly called for. Endymion Farrant. And this is Sylvie, my fiancée, though I still can't quite believe my luck in the matter. The girl beside him laughed a little self-consciously and put out her hand. She was small and dark, with the sort of quick, assessing eyes that Miss Marple approved of on sight. Eyes that took in a room and the people in it rather than merely being looked at by them. "You mustn't mind him, Miss Marple. He's been saying that to everyone for a fortnight, and I'm afraid it's starting to sound rather rehearsed." "Not rehearsed," said Endymion with mock injury. "Merely well practised. There's a difference." It was, Miss Marple thought, exactly the kind of easy, affectionate nonsense that young people in love talk to each other in front of strangers, and she smiled at them both with real pleasure and reflected, not for the first time, how very pleasant it was to watch happiness of that particular, uncomplicated sort before it has had time to be tried by anything at all. "And here," said Lady Blythewood, turning, "is someone who has been counting the hours, I think, rather more than the rest of us." Comfort Hatch had come into the hall so quietly that Miss Marple had not heard her, and for a moment she was rather ashamed of afterwards, she did not know her at all. The photograph in her case showed a thin, anxious child with an untidy plait. The woman who stood now in the firelight was small and stooped and grey, in a cardigan that had been good once and mended since, with hands that moved a little uncertainly, as though they were not perfectly sure of their welcome in the room. And then she smiled, and it was, after all, quite unmistakably the same face, the same quick, apologetic warmth about the eyes, and Miss Marple crossed the hall and took both her hands in both her own. "Comfort, my dear Comfort, how very long it has been. Jane." Comfort Hatch's voice shook very slightly, and she pressed Miss Marple's hands hard for a moment, before letting them go as though she had meant to say a good deal more than a name and had, at the last, said only that. "I am so glad, I can't tell you how glad, that you came. I was afraid you would think it a great piece of foolishness, writing as I did, and not come at all." "I could hardly do that," said Miss Marple, "once I knew it was you." "You must both come and sit by the fire and catch up on 40 years, said Lady Blythewood, with a warmth that somehow, without a single word being other than kind, contrived to sweep the two of them apart and into different chairs. Miss Marple to the sofa nearest the hearth, Comfort to a low stool a little further off, from which position Miss Marple could not help noticing she had a very good view of Lady Blythewood and rather a poor one of Miss Marple. Comfort does so love company, don't you, my dear, though she will tire herself out if someone doesn't watch her. Sit here, dear, out of the draught. You know how you feel the cold in that corner." "I'm perfectly warm, Isadora," said Comfort, in the tone of someone long practised in the particular art of not quite contradicting. "Nonsense, you're shivering. There." Lady Blythewood settled a cushion behind her companion's back with brisk, competent hands, and straightened, smiling round at the room in general. "She won't say a word for herself, you know, Miss Marple. 20 years I've had her, and I don't believe she's asked for so much as an extra blanket in all that time. I have to watch her like a hawk, or she'd sit in a freezing room all winter sooner than trouble anyone." It was said with every appearance of affectionate exasperation, and the room received it, Miss Marple observed, exactly as it was plainly meant to be received, as evidence wholly creditable to Lady Blythewood of a devoted and watchful kindness. Miss Marple, knitting quietly begun, and needles already moving, found herself thinking, without quite knowing why, of a nurse she had once known who managed her elderly patients with precisely that combination of brisk affection and unbroken supervision, and who had been, by all accounts, the very soul of devotion, and had also, though this came to nothing in the end, and was perhaps not fair to remember, contrived that not one of those patients should ever be left alone long enough to change a will that did not suit her. She said nothing of this, of course. It was after all no more than a fancy, prompted by nothing more substantial than a cushion. A tall, sandy-haired man had come in from what proved to be the library, carrying a leather document case under his arm, with the particular attention of someone who would rather be carrying nothing at all. "Ah, Mr. Raeburn," said Lady Blythewood, "our family solicitor, Miss Marple, and a martyr to duty. I told him he might leave his wretched papers till Monday, betrothal or no betrothal, but he will insist on making himself useful." "Trust business doesn't keep for weekends, I'm afraid," said Mr. Raeburn with a small, tight smile that did not reach as far as his eyes. He bowed slightly over Miss Marple's hand. "A pleasure. You must forgive me if I seem distracted. There are one or two matters connected with the trust that want settling before Mr. Farrant's marriage, and settling promptly." "How very dull that sounds," said Endymion cheerfully. "And how very glad I am it's your headache and not mine. Raeburn's been buried in ledgers all week. I keep telling him it'll all come out perfectly straightforward in the end." "I hope so," said Raeburn, and something in the flatness of it made Miss Marple glance up from her wool, though his face, when she looked, told her nothing beyond a solicitor's practised discretion, and perhaps, underneath that, a tiredness that had very little to do with paperwork. He excused himself almost at once, murmuring something about a telephone call that must be made before the office in Taunton closed, and the room, Miss Marple thought, seemed to breathe a little more easily once he'd gone, though she could not have said precisely why. "Poor Mr. Raeburn," said Sylvie when the library door had shut behind him. "He does work himself into such a state over the merest trifles. I'm sure it can't be good for him." "He's always been conscientious," said Lady Blythewood smoothly, and turned the conversation, with the practised ease of a hostess who has done it 1,000 times, to the arrangements for dinner, and whether Miss Marple had everything she wanted in her room, and how very fortunate they were that Mrs. Munday had excelled herself over the pheasant. Mrs. Munday herself appeared a few minutes later to say as much, a comfortable, red-faced woman who filled the doorway with her presence and her opinions in roughly equal measure, and delivered, in the course of announcing dinner, a small history of the pheasant's provenance, a complaint about the fishmonger, and a warm motherly greeting to Miss Hatch, looking peaky again. "I don't doubt it's this fog," all in the same unbroken breath, before Lady Blythewood, still smiling, suggested that dinner had perhaps waited long enough. It was over dinner, and afterwards, that Miss Marple tried, twice, to find herself alone with Comfort Hatch, and twice failed, not through any single visible obstruction, but through a kind of gentle, continuous redirection that she found, on reflection, rather more remarkable than any obstruction would have been. Lady Blythewood asked Comfort to fetch her spectacles, and then, when Comfort had fetched them, asked her to see whether the fire in the small drawing-room wanted mending. She drew Comfort into arranging the coffee cups. She sent her, with the kindest possible solicitude, to bed rather earlier than the rest of the party, on the grounds that she looked tired, and must not overtire herself on Miss Marple's very first evening. There would be a great deal of time, after all, for the two old friends to talk. Comfort went with a small, apologetic, backward glance that said, as plainly as any words could have done, that she had not wanted to go at all. Miss Marple, left with her knitting and the last of the coffee, thought about that glance for some while after the rest of the party had drifted off to billiards, or to bed, or to whatever else occupied a country house on a foggy November evening. She thought, too, about cushions fetched, and spectacles found, and a comfortable brisk voice that never once, in a whole long evening, allowed its devoted care of Comfort Hatch to lapse for so much as 5 minutes together. It was, she told herself, going up to her own room at last with a candle, along a passage that smelled pleasantly of beeswax, and rather less pleasantly of damp, no doubt nothing more than the ordinary fussing of a kind woman over a delicate old friend. She had known any number of such women in her life, and most of them had meant nothing more sinister by it than they appeared to mean. Most of them. She was a long time falling asleep. Chapter 3. Miss Hatch did not ring her bell. Miss Marple woke, as she generally did in a strange house, a little before it was properly light, and lay for some time listening to the particular silence of Farrant Grange. A silence made up, she came gradually to distinguish, of a clock somewhere below stairs, a very faint stirring of wind in the ivy outside her window, and, underneath it all, the settled, breathing quiet of a large house not yet awake. She'd gone to bed the night before, with every intention of finding comfort alone the very first thing in the morning, before the day could be filled up, as yesterday had so thoroughly and so pleasantly been filled up, with cushions and coffee cups, and the small, endless, kindly business of a house, preparing to celebrate something. She had lain awake rather longer than she cared to admit, turning over the events of the evening. Isadora Blythewood's bright, unbroken solicitude, Mr. Raeburn's tight, unhappy smile, the particular quality of Comfort's backward glance as she was sent up to bed, and had woken with the settled resolve of a woman who does not mean to let a second day go by as the first had gone. She was up and dressed, and had very nearly finished her tea, brought punctually by a rather sleepy housemaid at 7:30, before it occurred to her to wonder why the house seemed, this particular morning, rather more stirred up than a household usually is at that hour. There was a sound of doors opening and shutting with more than their ordinary briskness. A voice, once, raised somewhere below in a tone that did not carry its words but carried, quite unmistakably, its alarm. She was still buttoning her cardigan when there came a knock at her door, hurried and apologetic, and Mrs. Monday's face, considerably less comfortable than it had been the evening before, appeared round the edge of it. "Oh, miss, I'm ever so sorry to disturb you, but her ladyship thought— that is, I didn't know if you'd want telling, seeing as you're an old friend of hers and all. It's Miss Hatch, miss. She didn't ring for her tea this morning, which she always does, regular as the church clock, 7:30 on the dot, and when Ellen went up to see was she poorly, she couldn't get any answer, and Mrs. Mundy's hands, Miss Marple noticed, were working at her apron in a way that told her a good deal more than the words did. Her ladyship's up there now, miss, with the doctor sent for. I don't like the look of it at all, if you want my honest opinion, and I've known Miss Hatch 11 years. Miss Marple did not, in point of fact, ask for Mrs. Mundy's honest opinion, because there was no need. She had understood, from the moment the housekeeper's face appeared round the door, very nearly everything there was to understand, in the way that one understands, before a single confirming word is spoken, that a thing one has been quietly afraid of has, after all, come to pass. She went up at once, along the passage that had smelled the night before of beeswax and now smelled, faintly and unpleasantly, of something else, cold and closed and final, though nothing in the ordinary furniture of the corridor could have accounted for the impression. Comfort Hatch's room was small and plain and very tidy, in the particular way that the rooms of women who have spent their lives fitting themselves into other people's households tend to be tidy. Nothing left about that need not be there, nothing that presumed too much upon the space it occupied. Lady Blythewood was standing by the window in a wrapper, her grey hair down and loose about her shoulders, and for a moment before she turned, Miss Marple thought she looked entirely different from the confident, gracious woman of the evening before, smaller somehow, and genuinely shaken. Miss Marple— "Oh, my dear, I'm so glad you're up. I hardly know what to do." Lady Blythewood came across the room and took both Miss Marple's hands, exactly as Miss Marple herself had taken Comfort's the evening before, though the gesture offered now struck her rather differently. "It's Comfort. I'm so dreadfully afraid. The doctor is with her now, but I don't think there can be much doubt." Comfort Hatch lay very still and very small in the narrow bed, her grey hair loose upon the pillow, her face turned a little to one side, and there was nothing about her, Miss Marple thought, standing quietly just inside the door, while Dr. Ottershaw completed whatever it is that doctors complete in such circumstances that spoke of struggle or of pain, only a great and final stillness, the stillness of a woman who had, all her life, made as little trouble as possible and had continued, it seemed, to make as little trouble as possible in the manner of her going. It was all the same very sad, and Miss Marple felt it as sadness, quite genuinely, standing in that plain little room with its tidy chest of drawers and its single small vase of late chrysanthemums. Someone's kindness, she supposed, though who she could not have said, and its window looking out on fog that had not yet properly lifted from the lawn. Dr. Ottershaw straightened up at last, a brisk, weathered man of late middle age, with the particular unhurried confidence of a country doctor who has seen a very great deal of death and does not propose to be flustered by any more of it, and drew the sheet up with a practised, gentle economy of movement. "I'm very sorry, Lady Blythewood. There's nothing to be done, I'm afraid, and hasn't been for some hours. Her heart, without a doubt. She's had that weakness. What, 3 years now? 4? A woman of that age, with a chest like hers, and this fog on top of it. I've seen it a dozen times. Goes quietly in the night, generally. A mercy, really, when you think what it might have been." "She never complained," said Lady Blythewood, low, and pressed a handkerchief to her mouth for a moment. "That was comfort all over. She would never have wanted a fuss made." "No fuss to be made now, in any case," said Dr. Ottershaw, not unkindly, packing his bag with the brisk economy of a man for whom this was, professionally speaking, an entirely ordinary Tuesday morning. "I'll want a word about the certificate, but there's no mystery here. I promise you that much. A weak heart and a foggy November. It's an old story, and not, in my experience, one that generally needs looking into any further than that." Miss Marple, standing very quietly by the door with her hands folded in front of her, said nothing at all. She was looking, without appearing to look at anything in particular, at the small writing table that stood beneath the window. An ordinary little table, its blotter closed, a single pen laid neatly across it, an ink bottle with its stopper in, and she was thinking, though she could not for the moment have said precisely why the thought troubled her, that she had known a good many elderly ladies in her time who kept up a correspondence, and that such ladies' writing tables were very rarely so entirely, so completely tidy. A half-finished letter, an old envelope kept for its stamp, a note begun and abandoned. These were the ordinary litter of an old lady's desk, and Comfort Hatch, who had written to her only a week before in a hand that trembled with the effort of saying something she could hardly bring herself to say, didn't strike Miss Marple as a woman whose desk would, in the ordinary way of things, be quite so bare. She thought too, though this again was no more than a faint unease, the kind of thing one notices and then very nearly persuades oneself one has not noticed, that the bedclothes beneath the sheet Dr. Ottershaw had so gently drawn up had seemed, in the one brief glimpse she had permitted herself, not quite in the order one would expect of a woman who had, as Dr. Ottershaw so comfortably put it, simply gone quietly in the night. There had been a kind of disturbance to them, not violent, nothing that struck the eye at once as wrong, but a rocking and pulling of the blanket at one side that did not, somehow, match the picture of a peaceful and unresisted end. She said nothing of either observation. It was not, she reminded herself, the moment for it, standing in a room of new and genuine grief, with a doctor already satisfied, and a hostess already weeping, however genuinely, into her handkerchief. And besides, what were they, after all, when one set them down in plain words? A tidy desk, a rucked blanket, the sort of small, uneasy nothing that a fanciful old woman might make a great deal of and be perfectly wrong to. But she carried them both away with her, all the same, folded up small and put away, as she had once put away 100 other small, uneasy nothings in the course of a long life, against the day, should such a day ever come, when they might, after all, prove to mean something, what she could not put away nearly so easily. Going back down the quiet passage to her own room while the house began, behind her, the low, subdued business of a household absorbing sudden death, was the plain and simple fact that she had meant to seek comfort out the very first thing that morning and had lain in bed instead, thinking it over, while whatever had happened in that small tidy room had already by then very likely happened. She had received a letter that said, as plainly as such a letter ever could, "I am afraid, and I do not think I shall feel easy until you come." And she had come, and had spent a whole first evening being managed, with the greatest kindness in the world, out of every opportunity to hear what the fear had actually been. It was, she told herself, going into her own room and closing the door quietly behind her, no good at all reproaching herself for what could not now be helped. It had never yet done anyone the smallest particle of good in her considerable experience, and it would certainly not bring Comfort Hatch back to explain, in her own hesitant words, what had troubled her so. But she sat down by her window for a long while before she went downstairs, her knitting untouched in her lap, and thought, with a plainness she did not trouble to soften even to herself, that she had failed an old friend in the one small thing that friend had asked of her, to be listened to in time, and that whatever had frightened Comfort Hatch so badly that she had written, after 40 years of silence, to the one sensible person she could remember, had very probably frightened her with excellent reason. She did not think, sitting there in the thin, fog-filtered light of that November. Chapter 4. Nobody thought to ask the companion anything. Breakfast the following morning was a subdued affair, conducted in the particular hushed, over-considerate manner that households adopt in the day or two after a death. Voices pitched a little lower than usual, small kindnesses exchanged rather more carefully than the occasion strictly required. The toast-rack passed with an air of faint apology, as though the ordinary business of eating breakfast were itself a species of bad taste. Lady Blythewood, dressed now in a dark, becoming grey that fell just short of outright mourning, presided over the teapot with a composure that struck Miss Marple as, on the whole, entirely creditable. She had clearly wept. Her eyes bore that particular soft, reddened look that no amount of powder quite disguises, and she had equally clearly resolved not to weep any further at the breakfast table, for which forbearance the rest of the party seemed silently and collectively grateful. "Dr. Ottershaw is to call again this morning," she said, buttering a piece of toast she did not, so far as Miss Marple could see, have the smallest intention of eating. "Merely to complete the certificate, I understand. There's really nothing more to it than that, which is, I suppose, one small mercy in a very sad business. Poor Comfort would have hated any fuss made over her. She hated fuss of any kind, all her life." "She was always the least troublesome person imaginable," said Miss Marple, buttering her own toast with rather more attention than the operation strictly required. "Even as a child, I remember. She apologised, I recall, for a wasp stinging her once, as though it had been entirely her own fault for being in its way." "How exactly like her," said Lady Blythewood, with a small, fond, sorrowful smile that Miss Marple found she could not, upon reflection, fault in any particular. "She never asked anything of anyone, in all the years I had her. I used to tell her she should learn to make a nuisance of herself occasionally. It does one so much good, don't you find?" But she never would. "Did she seem to you," said Miss Marple, in the mild, unhurried tone of a woman making conversation rather than asking a question, "at all troubled these last weeks? Out of sorts, perhaps? Or anxious about anything in particular?" There was the very smallest pause before Lady Blythewood answered, so small that Miss Marple could not have sworn to it in a court of law, and would not in any case have thought to try. And then she said, with every appearance of gentle, considering honesty, "You know, now that you mention it, I did think her a little low this past fortnight or so. I put it down to her chest. The damp does try her dreadfully this time of year, and I dare say the excitement of the engagement, and having guests, was rather more than she was quite used to. She was never a strong woman, Miss Marple, whatever she might have looked to you, remembering her as a girl. I used to say to Dr. Ottershaw that her heart would be the end of her one day, and I'm afraid I've been proved a very poor sort of prophet to have been so entirely right." It was said with a sigh and a small self-deprecating shake of the head, and it closed as neatly as a door closing, the small opening Miss Marple's question had made. Sylvie, sitting a little further down the table with her hand very close to Endymion's on the cloth, glanced up at this and seemed, for a moment, on the point of saying something. Miss Marple, watching without appearing to watch, thought she saw the girl's quick dark eyes move once, thoughtfully, toward her future aunt by marriage. But whatever it was, she let it go unsaid, and buttered her own toast instead, with rather more concentration than the toast required. Dr. Ottershaw arrived a little after 10, brisk and weathered as before, and was closeted for some 20 minutes with Lady Blythewood in the small morning room, before emerging to take a cup of coffee, and, Miss Marple gathered from the general drift of the household, complete the small formalities that attend upon a death that surprises no one. She found her own opportunity to speak to him quite by accident, or what had every appearance of being an accident, in the hall as he was taking up his hat and bag. "A very sad business, Doctor," she said, "though I understand there was no doubt at all about the cause." "None whatever, Miss Marple, in the medical sense." Dr. Ottershaw settled his hat with the air of a man glad to be getting on with the rest of his morning. "A woman of that age, with that history, I attended her myself, on and off, these 3 years past for the heart, and it's exactly what I'd have predicted, given a bad enough fog and a bad enough night. There is one small thing," he added, pausing with his hand on the door, in the manner of a man remembering rather belatedly a professional obligation, "that I ought, I suppose, to mention to the police purely as a formality, a small bruise on the upper arm that I can't quite account for. Nothing in itself. Old ladies bruise if you look at them hard, and she may very well have knocked herself getting into bed, or against the bed-rail in the night, if she was taken poorly and tried to get up. But it's the sort of thing one's expected to note, and I shall note it, and I don't doubt for a moment it will come to nothing at all." "How very conscientious of you," said Miss Marple. "One learns to be in this profession," said Dr. Ottershaw, not without a certain dry satisfaction. "Though I'll tell you honestly, Miss Marple, between ourselves, I don't expect it to come to anything. I've been putting old ladies' hearts down on certificates for 30 years, and I know a natural death when I see one. It's the sort of bruise you'd get from a fall against the bed-rail, nothing more sinister than that, and I dare say the police will say exactly the same, once they've had their look." "I dare say they will," said Miss Marple, with perfect placidity, and watched him go out to his car with an expression that gave nothing whatever away, though she found herself thinking, once the door had shut behind him, that a man who troubled to reassure her, quite unasked, that there was nothing to be alarmed about, was very often a man who had, without perhaps admitting it to himself, felt some small private twinge of doubt worth reassuring away. The formality, as it turned out, brought Detective Inspector Merivale to Farrant Grange by the middle of the afternoon, a large unhurried man with a countryman's slow, deliberate way of speaking that Miss Marple had learned, over a great many years and a great many such men, generally concealed a mind a good deal quicker than it troubled to appear. He was shown into the morning room, saw Lady Blythewood, saw Dr. Ottershaw's note, and appeared, on the whole, disposed to treat the matter with exactly the degree of seriousness that a country doctor's small, conscientious caution seemed to warrant, which was to say, a good deal of outward thoroughness applied to what he plainly regarded in his own mind as very probably nothing at all. "Just a matter of tidying things up, my lady, you understand," he said to Lady Blythewood in the hall, where Miss Marple, knitting industriously in the window-seat, and to all appearances entirely absorbed in a drop stitch, had every opportunity to overhear him. "Doctor's quite satisfied as to the cause, and I don't doubt he's right, a man of his experience. But we do like to have everything in order, in a case where there's a bruise nobody can quite account for. And I understand there was a caller at the house not 2 days before Miss Hatch was taken poorly. Some fellow from an insurance office, was it?" "An annuity, I believe," said Lady Blythewood. Comfort had some small policy of her own. I really know very little about it. It was entirely her own private business, and quite right too. And Mr. Golightly, I think the man's name was, he called about some paper or other that wanted signing. I can't think what earthly interest it can be to you, Inspector, but you're welcome to the name if it's of any use." "Every little helps in the way of thoroughness," said Inspector Merivale comfortably, writing the name down in a notebook with the unhurried satisfaction of a man who has found something, however small, to be thorough about. "A stranger calling at the house, so close to the event. One likes to know these things, even where there's nothing in them. I dare say it comes to nothing whatever." Miss Marple, in the window seat, dropped a stitch quite genuinely this time, and took a moment or two recovering it, during which interval she reflected with a certain private and not entirely comfortable clarity upon the very great convenience, to whom, she was not yet prepared to say, even in the privacy of her own thoughts, of a stranger's recent visit to the house, arriving so opportunely to occupy an inspector's notebook, and how very much less convenient and very much less remarked upon by anyone at all, was the plain fact that an old woman had written, only a week before her death, a letter so frightened that she had not been able to say plainly what frightened her. Nobody, so far as Miss Marple could discover in the whole of that long, subdued afternoon, had thought to ask what Comfort Hatch herself might have had to say about her own death, had she been given the chance to say it while she still could. Nobody had thought to wonder what she had meant to write in that first, unsteady letter, beyond the vague and easily dismissed unease of an old companion's fancy. The inspector had his stranger, and his notebook, and his very reasonable, very thorough disposition to find nothing whatever amiss. Dr. Ottershaw had his weak heart and his fog, and Lady Blythewood, moving through the sad business of the day with unfailing, gracious composure, had contrived, without ever once appearing anything but the most devoted of friends, to be the person who answered every question that was put about Comfort Hatch, so that no one else in the house was ever quite required to answer one at all. Miss Marple finished her row, put her knitting neatly away, and went up to her room a little before it was time to dress for dinner, to sit for a while by her window and think, in the plain, unhurried way she generally reserved for matters she did not yet properly understand, about companions and Chapter 5, Old Debts Come Due at Cold Harbour. Mr. Golightly proved, upon production, to be a small, mild, exceedingly anxious man of perhaps 45, with the sort of face that seems permanently braced against being found fault with, and a way of clearing his throat before every sentence that suggested a lifetime spent apologising, on behalf of his employers, for the small print. He arrived at Farrant Grange the following morning at Inspector Merivale's request, in a state of visible agitation that struck Miss Marple, watching from the window-seat with her knitting, as considerably out of proportion to anything a man might be expected to feel over a routine call regarding an annuity. "I do assure you, Inspector, I called on Miss Hatch entirely in the way of business," he said, 3 times over, in the course of a conversation that Miss Marple, industriously turning a heel, had every opportunity to overhear from her corner of the morning-room, the inspector having made no particular effort to conduct it in private. A paper wanting her signature, that was all. A small alteration to the terms of her policy, quite in her own interest, I assure you, and nothing whatever out of the ordinary way. I have called on a great many elderly ladies in the course of my work, Inspector, and I promise you I have never yet had one of them die on me a day or 2 after, and I don't at all care for the coincidence. If I may say so, I don't care for it at all." "Nobody's suggesting anything sinister, Mr. Golightly," said Inspector Merivale, in the comfortable, unhurried tone of a man rather enjoying another man's discomfort. "Merely a matter of establishing who called at the house, and when, and why. What sort of alteration was it, might I ask, to the lady's policy?" "A perfectly ordinary one. A small increase in the premium, in exchange for a rather better rate of annuity, which I explained to her most carefully, and which she seemed, I thought, very glad of. She said— Mr. Golightly paused, and cleared his throat again, and looked, for a moment, genuinely troubled by something beyond his own professional anxiety. She said it was a comfort to know she'd have a little more in case. Those were her words, Inspector. In case. In case she should ever need to manage for herself. I didn't think anything of it at the time. One does one with elderly ladies. They're always thinking of managing for themselves, in my experience, whether or not there's the smallest likelihood of their ever having to. It was a small thing, and said quite without design, but Miss Marple, turning her heel with great deliberation and not looking up, found she had a use for it all the same, and put it carefully away with a tidy desk and the rucked blanket, in the growing collection of small uneasy nothings that she was not yet prepared to call by any plainer name. Mr. Golightly, having established to Inspector Merivale's evident, if not entirely reluctant satisfaction, that his business at Farrant Grange had begun and ended with a signature and a cup of tea in the housekeeper's room, was permitted to depart, still clearing his throat, and the inspector was left looking, Miss Marple thought, rather less pleased with his morning's work than he had looked at the start of it. A man who has followed a promising thread some way along its length, only to find it come, after all, to nothing very much. It was later that same afternoon, over the ironing of some small article of linen in the still room, a chore Mrs. Munday had undertaken to combine with a great deal of talk, and which Miss Marple, finding herself at a loose end and not entirely averse to Mrs. Munday's company, had drifted in to observe. That Miss Marple heard a good deal more about the general financial temper of the house than any direct question of hers could ever have been expected to produce. "Not that I'd say a word against her ladyship, mind," said Mrs. Munday, setting the iron down with a thump that rather undercut the disclaimer. "For a kinder woman never lived, whatever they say in the village. But there's talk, miss, and has been talk this 2 years past, that things aren't quite what they were at the Grange. Old Sir Julian left everything in the tightest sort of trust, so I've heard tell. Meant to keep it safe for Mr. Endymion when he came of age to marry, which is now, of course. And there's them in the village that say Mr. Rayburn's been a deal too free with the figures, one way and another, these last years. Not that I know the rights of it, miss. I'm only saying what's said, and I dare say half of it's nonsense, the way these things generally are." "People do talk so, in villages," said Miss Marple, folding a pillow slip with great care, "though I have generally found, in my own small experience, that there is very often a grain of something underneath even the most exaggerated talk." "What sort of thing is said, precisely?" "Well, that the households run a deal grander than the money quite allows for one thing, this many a year. All the entertaining and the new motor 2 summers back and her ladyship's charities, which are very handsome, I'm sure, and do her great credit, but handsome costs money same as anything else. And that Mr. Rayburn goes about looking, this 12-month past, like a man with a great weight on him, which he never used to, being a cheerful sort of gentleman when first he came to us, and that the trust was meant to come to Mr. Endymion whole, on his marriage, and there's some as wonder." Mrs. Munday lowered her voice, though there was no one else in the still room to hear her from long habit rather than present necessity. "Whether it'll come to him quite so whole as old Sir Julian meant it to." It was, Miss Marple reflected, exactly the sort of talk that circulates in every village in England about every house of any consequence in it, compounded of 1 part genuine observation to 3 parts embroidery, and not to be taken, in the ordinary way, as evidence of anything beyond the universal fondness of human nature for supposing the worst of its neighbours. "And has anyone been in to see to poor Miss Hatch's things?" she asked, in the same mild tone in which she might have asked whether the linen wanted turning. One does hate to think of a room simply left in a case like this. "Oh, her ladyship saw to that herself, miss, first thing yesterday morning, before any of us were properly about." Mrs. Munday took up a fresh piece of linen and shook it out with some vigour. "Wouldn't have Ellen near the room, nor me neither, though I'd have been glad to spare her ladyship the trouble, grieving as she was. 'No,' she says to me, 'I'll see to comforts things myself, Munday. I couldn't bear a stranger going through them. Meaning me, I suppose, though I've been 11 years in this house, and buried my own mother's effects with my own hands, and never thought myself a stranger to grief before. Very particular she was about it too, had the fire in the little grate going before breakfast, which I thought a queer thing to trouble over on a morning like that, with everything else there was to see to. Miss Marple said nothing beyond a small sympathetic murmur, and went on folding her pillow slip with every appearance of a mind on nothing more pressing than household linen. But she carried the remark away with her all the same, as carefully as she had carried away the tidy desk and the rucked blanket, and thought that a fire lit before breakfast, on a morning of such general confusion, was a very small thing to trouble a busy woman's memory, and a very odd thing all the same for that same memory to have troubled itself to keep. And yet she had noticed herself, without needing Mrs. Munday to point it out to her, that Mr. Rayburn's smile did not reach his eyes, and that a solicitor's trust business does not commonly keep a man working through a house party with quite such visible unhappiness. She got her fuller measure of the matter, however, not from Mrs. Munday, but from Sylvie Pennefather, who sought her out that evening in the small drawing-room, while Lady Blythewood was occupied with Endymion over some question of the wedding arrangements, and sat down beside her with the particular deliberate casualness of a young woman who has been waiting for an opportunity and does not quite know how to begin. "Miss Marple, I hope you won't think it dreadfully forward of me, talking to you like this, when we've known each other scarcely 2 days, but you seem— I don't know quite how to put it— you seem the sort of person one could say a thing to, without it going any further, or being thought silly for saying it." "I have generally found," said Miss Marple, "that things said to me do very often go no further, since so few people think an old woman with her knitting worth repeating. What is it you wanted to say, my dear?" Sylvie was quiet for a moment, her quick dark eyes fixed on the fire. "It's about Endymion's money, or what's to be his money when we marry. I know it sounds a dreadfully mercenary thing to be thinking of at a time like this, with poor Miss Hatch not 2 days gone. But I can't help noticing things, Miss Marple, and I've noticed that Lady Blythewood has grown careful this past year. Careful about the housekeeping, careful about what's spent and what isn't, in a way she never used to be, from everything Endymion tells me of how things were when his uncle was alive. And whenever the trust is mentioned, whenever Mr. Rayburn comes, which is oftener than he ever used to, there's a kind of a holding of the breath, if you understand me, that I don't think has anything to do with wedding settlements at all." "And what do you suppose it has to do with?" "I don't know," said Sylvie low, and twisted her hands together in her lap. "I only know that Endymion is the dearest, most trusting creature alive, and would never dream of questioning his own aunt about anything, and that somebody, I think, ought to be asking a question or two before we're married, and it's too late to ask them at all. I haven't liked to say so to Endymion. He'd only think I was worrying over nothing, or worse, that I cared more for the money than for him, which I don't, not in the least, only I should like to know that there is some for both our sakes, and that it hasn't all quietly gone somewhere." It was said with a young woman's mixture of embarrassment and genuine unwilling anxiety, and Miss Marple, listening, thought that here at last was a mind in the house sharp enough and independent enough of Chapter 6, the trust papers and Mr. Rayburn's silence. Inspector Merivale, having satisfied himself that Mr. Golightly's business at Farrant Grange began and ended with an annuity and a cup of tea, turned his slow, unhurried attention over the course of the following 2 days to the rather more interesting question of the family trust, a subject upon which, Miss Marple gathered from the general current of the house, he had begun by asking a very few, very ordinary questions, and had ended by asking a great many, with an increasing and quite unmistakable particularity. She was not present, of course, at his interviews with Mr. Rayburn, which were conducted with the library door firmly shut, but she had contrived on the second afternoon to be sitting with her knitting in the small anteroom adjoining it, engaged in a lengthy and entirely genuine piece of correspondence with her nephew Raymond, and it was in this position, A position she had not sought out for any particular reason, she would have said, beyond the excellence of the light by the window, that she overheard rather more of the library's business than either gentleman within it could have supposed. "I'm sure I've told you everything material, Inspector," Mr. Raeburn was saying, in a voice pitched with the particular careful evenness of a man keeping a much less even voice under strict control. "The trust is a perfectly straightforward one. Capital held for Mr. Endymion Farrant, income to Lady Blythewood during her lifetime, the whole to be made over to Mr. Farrant absolutely upon his marriage. There is nothing in the least irregular about it." "I don't doubt the trust itself is straightforward, sir," said Inspector Merivale, in the comfortable, deliberate tone Miss Marple had already come to recognise as the sound of a man taking a very great deal of trouble not to appear to be taking any trouble at all. "It's the accounts I'm asking after. You'll forgive my saying so, but you've been a fortnight going through figures that a solicitor of your experience might, I'd have thought, have had at his fingers' ends in an afternoon." There was a silence of the particular quality that Miss Marple had learned, over a long life of overhearing things she was not strictly meant to overhear, generally to precede either a lie or a very reluctant piece of truth. "Trust accounts of 30 years' standing are not always as tidy as one would wish," said Mr. Raeburn at last. "There have been adjustments over the years, reasonable ones. Lady Blythewood has had the management of the income during her lifetime, as is entirely usual, and has drawn upon it from time to time for the general expenses of the house, entertaining, charities, the upkeep of the estate, exactly as any woman in her position would. It is my business to see that the capital remains untouched, and I assure you it does." "And does it, sir?" Another silence, longer than the first. "The accounts will bear examination," said Mr. Raeburn, "by anyone properly qualified to examine them." It was, Miss Marple thought, laying down her pen and gazing out at the fog-grey garden with an expression of perfect vacancy, a very careful sort of answer. The sort of answer a man gives when he has satisfied himself, after some anxious calculation, that a particular statement is not in the strictest sense untrue, while remaining a very long way indeed from being the whole of what might be said. She had heard answers of that shape before, from choir boys accused of taking more than their fair share of the collection, and from at least one churchwarden whose accounting for the organ fund had occupied the parochial church council for the better part of a winter, and she had generally found that they meant a good deal more than they said, and considerably less than they hoped to convey. Inspector Merivale, for his part, appeared to have reached a very similar conclusion, for his next question, when it came, was put with the air of a man who has decided the time for general inquiry is past. "I understand there's rather more owing on the household accounts, generally speaking, than the estate quite covers these past 2 years. And I understand, too, that you yourself, Mr. Raeburn, have had some small financial difficulties of your own, of recent date. A man in your position, handling other people's money, it would want a deal of discipline, wouldn't it, to keep the two entirely separate in a bad year?" The silence this time was of an altogether different character. The silence, Miss Marple thought, of a man who's been struck somewhere he had believed himself well guarded. "I don't know what you mean, Inspector," said Mr. Raeburn, and his voice, for the first time in the whole exchange, had lost its careful evenness altogether. "I dare say you do, sir, when you've had a moment to think it over," said Inspector Merivale comfortably, and Miss Marple, gathering up her letter to Raymond with the unhurried air of a woman who has merely finished her correspondence, judged it a very good moment to remove herself from the anteroom before either gentleman emerged to find her there. She met Mr. Raeburn himself not 10 minutes later in the passage outside the small drawing-room, and was struck, freshly struck, though she had noticed something of the same thing on the evening of her arrival, by how very much older he looked than he had any business looking, a man who could not, she thought, be much above 45, with the grey drawn face and the restless hands of someone considerably further along in years or in trouble. Miss Marple, He inclined his head to her, with the automatic courtesy of a man whose manners continue to function quite independently of the rest of him. A wretched sort of week, one way and another. It has been a very sad one, Miss Marple agreed. You look tired, Mr. Raeburn, if you'll forgive an old woman saying so. I hope you're not letting the business of the trust weigh on you more than it need. These things generally come right, in my experience, once one has the courage to be quite open about them. It was said gently, and with no particular emphasis, and yet Mr. Raeburn's face, for just a moment, took on an expression of such naked, cornered unhappiness that Miss Marple felt quite genuinely a pang of pity for him, whatever else she might privately be thinking about the state of the Farrant Trust and the men who managed it. I wish I could believe that, Miss Marple, he said, low, and went on down the passage without waiting for any answer, in the manner of a man who has said a good deal more than he meant to, and is anxious to be gone before he says any more. Dinner that evening was a strained affair, for reasons that had, Miss Marple thought, very little to do with the ordinary business of mourning, and a great deal to do with the fact that Mr. Raeburn did not come down to it at all, pleading a headache of his own, a genuine one she rather suspected, and a considerably worse one than the fictitious article she had claimed for herself an hour before. Poor Mr. Raeburn, said Lady Blythewood, passing the vegetables with her usual unhurried grace. He does take these business worries so very much to heart. I've told him 12 times he oughtn't to let the trust accounts prey on him so. Old Sir Julian's affairs were never the tidiest in the world, and it's hardly Mr. Raeburn's fault if it takes a little patience to set them all in order. The inspector seemed to think it wanted rather more than patience, said Endymion, with the cheerful tactlessness of a young man who's not yet learned to read a room. Frightfully solemn about it all this afternoon. You'd have thought Raeburn had made off with the family silver the way he was going on. Endymion, said Sylvie, in a low voice that did not quite carry the reproof she plainly intended it to carry. Well, it's absurd, isn't it? Raeburn's been with the family 20 years. Father trusted him absolutely, and so do I. I don't see why a policeman doing his duty over poor Miss Hatch should suddenly turn the whole business of the trust into a criminal matter. Endymion helped himself to more potatoes with the untroubled appetite of a man for whom the trust had always been, and would presumably always remain, a comfortable abstraction rather than a source of any real anxiety. It'll all come right. These things generally do. I'm sure you're quite right, dear, said Lady Blythewood, and smiled at him with what looked, to Miss Marple's eye, very like genuine affection, and turned the conversation, with practised ease, to the question of whether the wedding might, after all, still be held in the spring, given everything that had happened, or whether it would be more seemly to wait until the summer. Miss Marple, listening, thought that it was a very curious thing to observe a household closing so smoothly, so instinctively, around the idea that whatever was wrong could only be Mr. Raeburn's wrongness. A comfortable, containable trouble, safely external to the family itself, requiring nothing more of anyone at the table than a little sympathy for an overworked solicitor and a proper confidence that things would, in the end, come right. It was, she thought, exactly the shape a household suspicion takes when it has been very gently, very skilfully, directed to fall somewhere other than where it began. It was later that same evening, going up rather early to bed with a headache she did not entirely possess, that Miss Marple passed the door of what had been Comfort Hatch's room, and found it standing ajar, with a warm, flickering light coming from within that could only be the fire. Lit again, she supposed, though the room had surely no further need of warming, now that its occupant was 3 days buried in the Coldharbour churchyard. She paused, without quite meaning to pause, and through the narrow gap of the door saw Lady Blythewood kneeling before the small grate, a wicker basket beside her half filled with papers, feeding the fire with slow, methodical care. Not the hasty, distracted gesture of grief, Miss Marple thought, but something altogether more deliberate, the unhurried thoroughness of a woman completing a piece of work she meant to see properly finished. Ah, Miss Marple. Lady Blythewood looked up, entirely composed, a little smile of sad apology already arranged upon her face, as though she'd been expecting at any moment to be discovered. "I'm afraid you've caught me at rather a melancholy task. Comfort's old letters, and one or two things of her mother's. Nothing of any value, but very—" Chapter 7. A doctor was sent for twice that night. Miss Marple was wakened, a little after midnight, by a commotion in the passage outside her room, of a kind she'd heard only once before in her life, under circumstances she had no wish whatever to be reminded of. A hurrying of feet, a low, urgent voice repeating a name, and beneath it all the particular quality of alarm that communicates itself through a house before a single word of explanation has been properly spoken. She was up, and had her wrapper about her, and was at her door before she had entirely finished being surprised to find herself there. It was Sylvie in the passage, in a dressing gown, her dark hair loose and her face white in the light of the single bracket lamp still burning. "Miss Marple? Oh, I'm so glad you're awake. It's Mr. Raeburn. Endymion's gone for Dr. Ottershaw, and Lady Blythewood's with him now, but I don't like the look of it at all. I don't like it in the least." "What has happened, my dear?" "I don't properly know. I heard a sort of a fall through the wall. My room's next to his, you see. And when I went in, because I couldn't get any answer at the door, he was—" Sylvie's hands, Miss Marple noticed, were shaking quite badly. "There's a bottle by the bed, Miss Marple, his sleeping tablets. I don't know how many were in it to start with, but there's precious few left now." Miss Marple asked no further questions, but went down the passage with Sylvie at a pace rather brisker than her usual measured progress, and found, in the doorway of Mr. Raeburn's room, a scene of the particular hushed, contained urgency that generally attends such discoveries in a well-run household. Lady Blythewood already there before them, kneeling by the bed in her wrapper with a competence that spoke of some considerable experience of sick rooms, doing what could be done, which was principally a matter of keeping the stricken man from slipping further into whatever depth he had already reached, until help could properly arrive. "He's breathing at least," said Lady Blythewood, without looking up, her voice perfectly steady in a way that struck Miss Marple, even in the confusion of the moment, as rather remarkable. "Endymion's gone for the doctor. He should be here directly. He only left 10 minutes ago. There's nothing more we can do but keep him as he is and wait." It was, in the event, not very long before the sound of a car in the drive announced Dr. Ottershaw's arrival, roused for the second time in the space of a week by a death, or something very near it, in the same house, and looking, Miss Marple thought, considerably less brisk and considerably more grave than he had looked over Comfort Hatch's quiet passing. He worked over Mr. Raeburn for the better part of an hour, with Lady Blythewood assisting him with a calm efficiency that only Miss Marple, watching quietly from the doorway with Sylvie's cold hand gripped in her own, seemed to find in any way remarkable, and at the end of it pronounced, with the particular flat weariness of a man who has been more frightened than he cared to admit, that the patient would very probably live. "A near thing, mind," he said, washing his hands afterwards in the basin Mrs. Munday, roused in her turn, and standing in the passage in a voluminous wrapper with an expression of profound and genuine shock, had thought to bring up. "Another half hour, and I don't know that I'd answer for him. He'll sleep it off now, under watching, and be fit to talk by morning, or near enough." Inspector Merivale, summoned by telephone at Dr. Ottershaw's own insistence, arrived a little before dawn, and stood for some time in the passage outside Mr. Raeburn's door, with the look of a man to whom a great many things have suddenly become, or have appeared to become, very much clearer than they were the evening before. "Well," he said to no one in particular, though Miss Marple, sitting quietly in a chair someone had thought to bring her, was near enough to hear it. "I don't say it proves anything, not in a court of law, but a man doesn't generally try to make away with himself the same week his handling of a trust's come under question, unless he's got a good deal more on his conscience than a shortage in the accounts." "You believe he has confessed, then, Inspector?" said Miss Marple mildly. "By the mere act of being ill?" Inspector Merivale looked at her with the particular tolerant courtesy he had shown her throughout, a courtesy that did not, Miss Marple was perfectly well aware, extend to taking her question with any great seriousness. It's not an unreasonable inference, ma'am, in my experience. A guilty man, cornered, will very often do something of the kind rather than face what's coming to him. We'll know more when he can talk." He knew a good deal more, as it turned out, by the middle of the following morning, when Mr. Raeburn, grey, hollow-eyed and profoundly ashamed, propped up against his pillows with Dr. Ottershaw hovering in cautious attendance, was pronounced fit enough to be spoken to, and Miss Marple, present in the room at Lady Blythewood's own kindly insistence that a familiar face might help steady him, heard the whole of it. "I never touch Miss Hatch," Mr. Raeburn said, in a voice scraped thin with exhaustion and something very near despair. "I swear it before God, Inspector, I never laid a finger on her. I never had cause to. I scarcely exchanged a dozen words with the woman in all the years I've known this family. What I did—" He stopped, and pressed a shaking hand over his eyes, and went on, in the flat, defeated tone of a man past caring what the words might cost him, now that the worst has already, in his own mind, happened. "There's been money taken from the trust income over the years. Not a great deal, a little here, a little there, against debts of my own, that I always meant to make good, and always did make good, until this last 12-month when I couldn't. I meant to have it straight before the wedding, before anyone had cause to look closely. That's the whole of my crime, Inspector. Cowardice, and bad debts, and putting off a reckoning I hadn't the courage to face. When you began asking your questions, I saw it was all coming out at last, and I thought— I don't rightly know what I thought. That it would be easier, perhaps, than living through the disgrace of it. I'm ashamed to say it aloud in front of a lady, but there it is. It had nothing whatever to do with Miss Hatch. Nothing at all." There was a silence in the room after this that Miss Marple thought had in it a great deal more than simple relief, though relief was certainly present. Sylvie's hand had found Endymion's, and Endymion himself, Miss Marple noted, looked genuinely and simply glad, in the manner of a young man for whom loyalty to an old family friend had never seriously wavered, whatever the inspector's questions might have implied, while Lady Blythewood's face wore an expression of grave, sorrowful sympathy that struck Miss Marple, watching with the particular attention she had learned to give to faces at such moments, as being not quite so simple a thing as it appeared. "You mustn't reproach yourself too bitterly, Mr. Raeburn," Lady Blythewood said, leaning forward to lay a gentle hand upon the coverlet. "We have all of us been foolish about money at one time or another. It is a very human failing, and I am only thankful, so very thankful, that it is nothing worse." "You're kinder than I deserve, Lady Blythewood," said Mr. Raeburn, and shut his eyes, and said no more, and Dr. Ottershaw, judging his patient to have said quite enough for one morning, shepherded the rest of the party gently from the room. "You'll want to verify all this against the actual figures, of course, Inspector, Mr. Raeburn went on, with the exhausted thoroughness of a man determined, now that he had begun, to leave nothing further concealed. "I'll give you every paper, every ledger, and welcome. There's nothing more to hide now. God knows I've learned what hiding it costs a man." Inspector Merivale, closing his notebook with the air of a man whose morning certainties have been very thoroughly overturned, was heard by Miss Marple to observe to Dr. Ottershaw, in the passage outside, that it was a rum business altogether, and that he was blessed if he knew, now, where a man was to look next. The solicitor cleared, after a fashion, of the one crime that mattered, and left holding nothing but a smaller, sadder one of his own. The stranger from the annuity office cleared before him, and nothing whatever that anyone had yet found to explain why a harmless old companion, who had troubled no one in 20 years, should have died as she died, in the one house in England where she ought to have been safest. Miss Marple, left alone for a few minutes in the small sitting-room while the household dispersed to snatch what rest it could before breakfast, sat for a while with her knitting quite forgotten in her lap, turning over the whole strange, wearing night. She thought of Sylvie's white, frightened face in the passage, and of the girl's own reproach to herself for a room's mere accident of position, and she thought, too, of the particular steadiness with which Lady Blythewood had knelt by a dying man's bed, competent and unhurried, exactly as she had knelt a week before by a dead woman's. The same brisk, capable kindness, offered twice now within the space of a single week, to two people who had each, in their different ways, come rather too close to the family's private trouble for comfort. It was, she told herself, no more than the ordinary competence of a woman used to running a large household through every sort of crisis. She was aware, even as she told herself so, that she did not entirely believe it. Miss Marple, going down to breakfast a little late that morning, having sat rather longer than usual by her window first, thought privately that Inspector Merivale had put the matter, without in the least intending to, exactly as it ought to be put. It was indeed a very curious thing that a woman who had troubled no one in 20 years should have died as she had died, unless of course she had at last, in the very last days of her life, begun to trouble someone a very great deal. She thought too, going into a breakfast table considerably lighter in spirit than it had been for some days past, relief being after all a thing that shows itself at table whether or not it is entirely earned, that she had watched a great many people receive good news in her life, and that Lady Blythewood's particular manner of receiving this piece of it, gracious, grave, and entirely composed, was not quite the manner of a woman for whom the news had actually been good. Chapter 8. Mrs. Callow's Old Habit Remembered. The house, in the days that followed Mr. Raeburn's slow and closely watched recovery, settled into the particular subdued quiet that comes after a crisis has passed, without quite resolving anything. Everyone a little more careful of everyone else, a little more inclined to talk of the weather, and underneath it all a general unspoken sense that the true trouble, whatever it was, remained exactly where it had always been, unaddressed and unexplained. Miss Marple spent a good deal of that time with her knitting, in whatever corner of the house offered the best light and the least likelihood of interruption, and found, as she so often found in such circumstances, that the small mechanical business of counting stitches left the greater part of her mind entirely free to wander over the events of the past 10 days, turning them this way and that, as one turns a stone over to see what has been growing underneath it. She thought a great deal about cushions. It was, she was aware, rather an absurd thing to have fixed upon, out of so much that had happened since her arrival. A death, a bruise nobody could account for, a solicitor's shabby private trouble laid bare before the whole household. And yet she found she could not put it from her mind that first evening, with its fetched spectacles and its solicitous cushion, and its unbroken, watchful kindness that had, in the space of a single evening, contrived that Comfort Hatch should never once be left alone in a room with the one person she had crossed a county to speak to. "You're very thoughtful this morning, Miss Marple," said Sylvie, coming to sit beside her in the small drawing-room, where a thin, watery sun was doing its best, without much success, to brighten a room that faced resolutely north. Or is that a foolish thing to say to someone with knitting in her lap? I suppose one is always thoughtful doing that. Not always usefully so, said Miss Marple, smiling, but I was thinking, as it happens, about kindness, about the particular kind of kindness that never lets a person alone. Have you ever noticed it, my dear? There are people who love us, and are glad to see us happy in our own way, and there are people who love us, or say they do, and are only ever quite comfortable when they know precisely where we are and what we're doing and who we're talking to. Sylvie was quiet for a moment. You mean Lady Blythewood and Miss Hatch? I did not say so, said Miss Marple mildly, but since you have, I shan't pretend I wasn't thinking it. She was never left alone with me, you know, that first evening. Not for 5 minutes together. I've been turning it over ever since, and I find it troubles me rather more than it perhaps ought to trouble a sensible woman. It isn't only that. Sylvie twisted her hands together in the way Miss Marple had come to recognise as a prelude to something she had been holding back. It's the housekeeping money, and the way every servant in the place is managed down to the last teaspoon, and the way Endymion himself, grown man that he is, and my own fiancé, and dearly as I love his easy nature, never seems to spend a shilling that Lady Blythewood hasn't somehow already accounted for. She calls it looking after us all. I dare say it is looking after us all. Only sometimes, Miss Marple, being looked after quite so thoroughly begins to feel very like being watched." It was at this point, and Miss Marple was never afterwards quite able to say what precise word or turn of Sylvie's phrase had done it, only that it had happened all at once, with the particular small complete click of a key finding its lock, that she found herself thinking not of Farrant Grange at all, but of a narrow, overfull little house in St. Mary Mead, and a woman called Mrs. Callow, whom she had not thought of in a very long time. Mrs. Callow had kept house, for the better part of 30 years, for a sister a good deal younger and considerably more delicate than herself, and had been generally reckoned by the whole of St. Mary Mead the very model of devoted care, forever fussing over Lily Callow's health, forever managing her small affairs, forever seeing to it that dear Lily was never overtaxed by a visit, or a letter, or a decision that Mrs. Callow could not more comfortably make for her. And it had been noticed, though noticed only idly, in the way such things are noticed in a village, and put down to nothing more sinister than an older sister's fussy affection, that whenever Lily's rare visitors did at last take their leave, whatever small gifts or letters or trifles they had brought with them were by the following morning invariably gone, given away to the jumble sale, or burned, or simply vanished, so that no trace remained of the visit at all, beyond what Lily herself could be brought to remember of it, which was generally by then rather less than she had known at the time. Miss Marple had thought nothing of it in those days, beyond a mild and passing reflection that Mrs. Callow was perhaps a shade too thorough in her tidying. It was only very much later, after Lily Callow's death and the quiet, dreadful discovery that followed it, of just how very much of her sister's own small income Mrs. Callow had, over 30 patient years, contrived to divert to her own use, aided by nothing more elaborate than an unbroken vigilance that no visitor, no letter, no chance remark should ever remain long enough in the house to be properly gone through, that Miss Marple had understood what that particular tireless tidiness had actually been for. It had not been grief or fussiness, or even simple house-proud thoroughness. It had been the swift, unfailing removal of anything that might, left too long in the light, have shown Lily Callow the truth of her own situation. "Miss Marple?" said Sylvie, a little uncertainly, for Miss Marple had fallen entirely silent, her needles motionless in her lap, gazing at the thin northern light with an expression the girl could not quite read. "Have I said something?" "You have said a great deal, my dear, and very usefully," said Miss Marple, coming back to herself, and taking up her knitting again with rather more decision than before. "You have reminded me of someone I knew a long time ago, who was thought the kindest woman in the world, and was nothing of the kind." "What happened to her?" "Mrs. Callow, I mean, since you clearly mean me to ask." "She died eventually, a very old woman, respected by everyone in the village, and it was only after her sister's death, some years before her own, that the truth of the whole business came out at all, and came out then only by the merest accident, through a bank manager who happened to mention, quite innocently, a sum of money that ought to have been very much larger than it was. Nobody had ever suspected her of anything, you understand, because nobody had ever had cause to look. She had seen to that so thoroughly, and for so many years, that there was simply nothing left lying about for anyone to look at." Miss Marple's needles moved steadily as she spoke, her eyes on her work rather than on Sylvie's face. "It is a very useful sort of kindness, my dear, if one happens to have something that wants concealing. It looks exactly like love, to anyone who's not paying very close attention, and most people I find are not paying very close attention at all. You think Lady Blythewood has something that wants concealing. I think," said Miss Marple carefully, "that I should like very much to know precisely what became of Comfort's papers, and precisely when, and by whom, before I allow myself to think anything at all beyond that. It is a great mistake, my dear, to arrive at one's conclusion before one has properly gathered one's facts, though I will own that I have very rarely been so glad of a chance remark as I am of yours this morning. I wonder, would you think it very odd of me if I went to have a word with Mrs. Munday?" She found the housekeeper in the still room once again, engaged this time upon the sober business of counting linen against a list, and greeted with the same unaffected warmth Mrs. Munday had shown her from the first. "That fire you mentioned to me, Mrs. Munday, the one her ladyship had going in the little grate before breakfast, on the morning poor Miss Hatch was found. I have been wondering, which grate would that have been precisely?" "Why, the morning room, miss, the little one that faces east that's scarcely used from one month's end to the next, on account of the chimney smoking if the wind's in the wrong quarter. I did think it a queer place to choose. Now you mention it, seeing as there's a perfectly good fire laid in Miss Hatch's own room, that would have done just as well and a deal more natural, but her ladyship said something about not wanting the smell of burning paper in a room where the poor soul had only just— Well, I didn't like to argue the point, miss, not that morning of all mornings." "And was the grate swept afterwards, do you know? Properly cleared out?" Mrs. Munday considered this with the particular frowning thoroughness of a woman confronted with a question about her own domain that she is faintly ashamed not to have a ready answer for. "Now that you ask, miss, I don't believe it was. Not that day, at any rate, with everything else there was to see to, and the room being so little used nobody thought to trouble over it since. I dare say the ash is sitting there yet if nobody's been in to disturb it." "I dare say it is," said Miss Marple, with a small, thoughtful smile that Mrs. Munday, bent once more over her linen list, did not observe, and did not, in consequence, find any occasion to wonder at. Miss Marple went back to the drawing-room by a route that took her, quite by chance, past the door of the little morning-room that faced east, and paused there for a moment, her hand upon the handle, in the particular unhurried, deliberate stillness of a woman who has, after some days of turning a great many small and separate uneasy things over in her mind, arrived at last at the settled conviction that they are not, after all, separate things at all. She did not go in. There would be time enough for that, she thought, and it wanted perhaps rather more than her own two eyes to make proper use of whatever might be found there. But she stood for a moment longer, all the same, thinking of Mrs. Callow, and of 30 years of unfailing, tireless kindness, and of how very seldom in her own long experience true grief troubled itself to be quite so thorough. Chapter 9. The half-burned page in the grate. It was not, in the end, so very difficult a thing to arrange as Miss Marple had half feared it might be. A little morning-room, facing east, scarcely used from one month's end to the next, was not a place whose privacy anyone in the house had the smallest reason to guard, and Miss Marple, who had spent a long lifetime perfecting the art of being present in a room without appearing to have any particular business there, found it the work of a very few minutes, on a grey and blessedly uneventful Tuesday afternoon, to secure both the room and Mrs. Munday's unsuspecting company at one and the same time. "I wonder, Mrs. Munday, whether you would be so very kind as to help me look for something," she said, having drawn the housekeeper in on the pretext of a lost handkerchief, dropped, she believed, somewhere about the house that morning, though she was not, she added apologetically, perfectly certain where. "I have the most tiresome habit of losing things, and this one was a particular favourite. My sister's, originally, and I should be sorry to think of it thrown out with the sweepings." Mrs. Munday, only too glad to be of use, and entirely innocent of the fact that she was assisting at anything more than a mild domestic hunt, got down without hesitation on her knees before the little grate, the one room in the house, as it happened, that neither of them had yet had cause to search, and began turning over the cold ash with the brisk, unsentimental thoroughness of a woman who has searched a good many grates for a good many lost trifles in her time. "Nothing here but old ash, miss, so far as I can— Why, whatever's this?" It was a very small thing to have found. A scrap of paper, no larger than a visiting card, scorched black along one edge, and curled with the heat it had been subjected to, but not, as its fellows had evidently been, consumed entirely. It had fallen, Miss Marple judged, examining it with the greatest care once Mrs. Munday had passed it to her in some perplexity, into a corner of the grate a little apart from the main body of the fire, where the draught from the old chimney had not quite reached it, and had lain there undisturbed, under a covering of finer ash, for the better part of a fortnight. "How very curious," said Miss Marple, turning it gently to the light. "It looks to me like the corner of some kind of banking paper, Mrs. Munday. A deposit slip or something of that character. Do you see the printed line here and the figures? I wonder how such a thing came to be burned in this room, of all rooms in the house. I couldn't say, miss, I'm sure, unless it's some of what her ladyship was seeing to that first morning, though what a bank paper should be doing among poor Miss Hatch's letters, I couldn't tell you." Mrs. Munday's broad, comfortable face had taken on an expression of faint, honest bewilderment, entirely unclouded by any suspicion of what she had, in fact, just helped to uncover. "Is it your handkerchief's twin you're after, miss? Or has this driven the poor thing clean out of your head?" "I believe," said Miss Marple, folding the fragment with great care into a clean pocket handkerchief of her own, "that I have found something rather more useful than my handkerchief, Mrs. Munday, though I am exceedingly grateful for your help in finding it. I wonder if you would do one more kindness for me, and say nothing of this to anyone, for the present, not even to her ladyship. I promise you it is in nobody's interest but the truth's, and I think you loved Miss Hatch well enough, in your own way, to want the truth found, whatever shape it turns out to have." Mrs. Munday, who had indeed been fond of Comfort Hatch, in the unfussy, practical way of servants who have waited on a quiet, undemanding mistress for the better part of a decade, looked for a moment as though she might ask a great many questions, and then, meeting Miss Marple's eye, appeared to think better of it, and merely nodded, with the particular solemn discretion of a woman who understands that she has been trusted with something, and means to prove worthy of the trust. The figures upon the fragment, when Miss Marple examined them properly by the better light of her own room, told her a good deal less on their own than she had hoped, and a good deal more than she had quite expected. A printed heading from a bank in Taunton, a column of figures cut off before any total could be read, and a date, faint but legible, that placed the transaction some 11 years in the past. A very great many years, Miss Marple thought, before Mr. Raeburn's own recent and rather smaller troubles could possibly have had any bearing on the matter at all. She sat for some while, once Mrs. Munday had gone about her business, turning the little fragment over and over in her fingers, and thought that it was a very small and unremarkable-looking thing to have travelled so far in its way to reach her, from a Taunton bank to a trust ledger, to a frightened old woman's hands, and thence to a hasty fire in a room nobody used, and so, by the merest chance of a draught and a covering of finer ash, into her own handkerchief. She thought of Comfort's letter, and the trembling hand that had written, "Something is not quite right here," and understood, with a plainness that gave her very little satisfaction, that she was very probably holding, at last, the precise small piece of wrongness that letter had been trying so haltingly to describe. It wanted, she judged, someone who understood the actual workings of the Farrant Trust to make proper sense of it, and there was only one such person now at liberty to be asked, Mr. Raeburn himself, still pale and subdued from his ordeal, but restored, by that afternoon, to something approaching his ordinary self, and evidently glad, in the particular chastened way of a man who has confessed the worst of himself, and found the world had not, after all, ended of any occupation that allowed him to feel useful again. She found him in the library, surrounded by precisely the ledgers he had promised Inspector Merivale, and put the fragment before him without preamble. "Mr. Raeburn, I wonder if you would be so kind as to tell me what you make of this?" He took it, frowning, turned it to the light exactly as she had done, and then went very still. "Where did you find this, Miss Marple?" "In a grate that had no business having a bank paper burned in it at all. Does the date mean anything to you?" "It means a great deal, if I am reading it rightly, and I don't think I can be mistaken." Mr. Raeburn set the fragment down with the careful precision of a man handling something he has suddenly understood to be dangerous. 11 years ago, that would be very shortly after Sir Julian's death, when Lady Blythewood first came into the management of the trust income. I have gone through the accounts of that period a dozen times this past fortnight, looking for my own errors, and I recall now there was a withdrawal, a substantial one, against the capital rather than the income, authorised by Lady Blythewood alone under a power Sir Julian had left her for emergencies, and never afterwards, so far as the books show, repaid. I took it, when first I found it, for an old and properly settled matter, long since squared away. There was a note in the file suggesting as much, in Lady Blythewood's own hand. But if this... He touched the fragment again, and did not finish the sentence. If this was the record that proved it had never in fact been repaid at all, said Miss Marple gently, and Comfort Hatch, going through old papers on some perfectly innocent errand, chanced to find it. Mr. Raeburn looked at her for a long moment, and Miss Marple watched a great many things move across his tired, honest face. Shock and a dawning, horrified comprehension, and beneath it all, unmistakably, an enormous and rather shameful relief, of the kind a man feels on discovering that the worst thing in the world was not, after all, the thing he had spent a fortnight believing it to be. I would need the full ledgers to be certain, the ones I've only lately begun to go through properly. Now there's no longer any reason of my own to avoid them. But I can tell you this much, Miss Marple, freely and honestly. If what you're suggesting is true, then the shortfall in that trust goes back a good deal further than anything of my making, and to a hand a good deal higher up the house than mine. He passed a hand over his face. God help me, I've spent a fortnight in an agony of guilt over a few £100 of my own shabby debts, while all the time, Miss Marple finished for him quietly, there was very possibly a great deal more at stake than either of us yet properly understands. I think, Mr. Raeburn, that this is a matter for Inspector Merivale now, and not for you and me alone. Will you come with me and tell him what you have just told me? They found the inspector, as it happened, in the small estate office off the hall, engaged upon the dogged, unglamorous business of cross-checking Mr. Raeburn's surrendered ledgers against his own notes, and looking, Miss Marple thought, very much like a man who had begun to suspect that his morning's certainties had further still to travel before they arrived anywhere useful. He heard them out, the fragment, the date, Mr. Raeburn's careful, chastened account of the 11-year-old withdrawal and its supposed settlement, with the particular slow, deliberate attention Miss Marple had come to recognise as his most valuable quality, whatever his earlier haste over Mr. Golightly, and the annuity might have suggested to the contrary. You're telling me, Miss Marple, that you believe Miss Hatch found evidence, going through old papers, that Lady Blythewood had taken money from this trust a good many years back and never made it good. I am telling you what the fragment appears to show, Inspector, and what Mr. Raeburn's own knowledge of the accounts confirms is at least possible. I would not go so far as to say I am certain of anything beyond that. I am not a banker, and I have not seen the full ledgers, and it is a very serious thing to say of anyone, let alone a woman who has shown me nothing but kindness since I arrived under her roof. But I will say this. Comfort Hatch wrote to me, before ever I came to this house, that something was not quite right, and that she did not know how to say what it was. I think she had found precisely this, with that chapter 10 beside Miss Hatch's grave. At last. They found Lady Blythewood in her own morning room. Not the little east-facing room with its telltale grate, but her own private sitting-room upstairs, where she had gone, after luncheon, to write letters, and where she received Inspector Merivale and Miss Marple with every appearance of her habitual unruffled graciousness, rising from her writing-table with a smile already prepared. Inspector and Miss Marple too. How very solemn you both look. Don't tell me Mr. Raeburn's ledgers have thrown up some fresh trouble. They have thrown up a good deal, my lady, said Inspector Merivale, though not quite of Mr. Raeburn's making, as it turns out. He laid the scorched fragment upon her writing-table, beside the letter she had been writing, with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who has decided there is no longer any profit in haste. Found in the grate of the little morning-room, my lady, the one that's scarcely used. Mr. Raeburn tells me it's the corner of a deposit slip, 11 years old, relating to a withdrawal against the trust capital that was never, so far as the ledgers show, made good. For just a moment, so brief that Miss Marple, watching with the particular close attention she had given to faces throughout this whole sad business, was afterwards not perfectly certain she had not imagined it. Something moved behind Lady Blythewood's composed, handsome features, some swift and total recalculation, gone almost before it could be named. And then it was gone, and she was smiling again, faintly puzzled, entirely gracious. "I'm sure I don't know what that has to do with anything, Inspector. Old trust matters are hardly my province. You must ask Mr. Rayburn, or the bank." "I think, Lady Blythewood," said Miss Marple quietly, "that it has a very great deal to do with why Comfort Hatch died." The room was very still. Outside, a rook called once, harshly, somewhere in the bare trees above the drive, and Lady Blythewood's hand, resting upon the back of her writing chair, tightened for a moment upon the wood before she spoke again, in a voice that had lost none of its graciousness and gained, all the same, a certain careful, watchful quality that had not been there before. "That is a very extraordinary thing to say to me, Miss Marple, in my own house." "It is," Miss Marple agreed. "I have thought a great deal these past 10 days about kindness, the kind that sets a person free, and the kind that never once lets them out of its sight. I knew a woman once in my own village who kept house for her sister for 30 years, and was thought, by everyone who knew her, the very model of devoted care, fetching and fussing, and seeing to it that dear Lily was never overtaxed by a visit or a letter that had not first passed through her own hands. And it was only after Lily's death that anyone discovered what that unfailing kindness had actually been protecting. Not her sister's health at all, but a great many years of her sister's money, quietly taken and never repaid, and kept safe from discovery by the simple, tireless expedient of never once letting Lily be alone long enough with anyone, or anything, that might have shown her the truth. I have not the smallest notion what this village story of yours is supposed to prove, Miss Marple. I think you have every notion, Lady Blythewood. You never once left Comfort alone with me that first evening. A cushion fetched, a fire to be seen to, spectacles to be found, until at last she was sent up to bed before she had said 3 words to me in private. I thought it kindness then. I have come to think it was watchfulness, of exactly the same kind Mrs. Callow showed her sister, and for exactly the same reason. Comfort had found something sorting old papers for you, this, or something very like it, and had begun, in her own frightened, apologetic way, to write to the one old friend she thought might help her make sense of it. She did not fully understand what she had found. I do not think she ever properly understood it, poor soul, right up to the end. But she had found enough to trouble her very badly, and enough, I think, to trouble you a great deal more, once you understood what she had found, and that she had written to someone about it before you could stop her. "This is monstrous," said Lady Blythewood, but her voice for the first time had thinned, and her hand had left the chair back to press, briefly against her own breast, in a gesture Miss Marple thought was very nearly the first entirely unguarded thing she had seen the woman do. "There is a bruise, my lady," said Inspector Merivale, taking up the account with the same slow, deliberate care that Dr. Ottershaw noted on Miss Hatch's arm and thought nothing of at the time. "The sort of mark he tells me now I've asked him to think it over properly, that a hand might leave, gripping hard, holding someone still, and a bell that never rang, though Miss Hatch was a woman who'd rung it, regular as the church clock, every morning of the 11 years Mrs. Munday had known her. A woman taken poorly in the night and frightened generally has time enough to reach for a bell before she's past reaching for anything. A woman taken by surprise, in her sleep, by someone she trusted enough never to think of crying out against, she has no such time at all." Lady Blythewood said nothing for a long moment, standing very straight beside her writing table, with the small ruined fragment of paper lying between her letters, and when at last she spoke, the graciousness had gone out of her voice entirely, leaving something flatter and older and considerably more tired. I never meant to take so much in the beginning. Julian left it in my hands to manage, a discretion he called it, in case of emergency. And there was an emergency that first year, debts of my own from before our marriage that I could not bear him to know of, even in his will, even after he was gone. I meant to put it back. I always meant to put it back, a little at a time, out of the income, and there was always some fresh claim on the income before I could. The house, the entertaining, the... She stopped, and something like the ghost of her old gracious smile crossed her face, entirely without warmth. One does not stop being the most hospitable woman in the county simply because one can no longer quite afford it, Inspector. One goes on being it, and hopes. And Miss Hatch, said Inspector Merivale, Comfort found the old papers by pure accident. I sent her to clear a drawer of Julian's I had quite forgotten still held anything of the sort, and she came to me, so anxious, so apologetic, asking whether I knew that some of the figures didn't seem to... She hadn't the least idea what she'd found, you understand. She only knew that something troubled her, and that she did not like to trouble me with it, and so, being Comfort, she wrote instead to an old friend for advice, rather than ask me outright and risk giving offence. Lady Blithwood's mouth twisted. That was always her difficulty, poor Comfort, never troubling anyone. I found the letter, unfinished, still on her blotter, one evening when I went to see was she resting, and I understood then precisely how little time I had left, with Endymion's wedding forcing a full accounting, and now some stranger about to descend on the house and hear the whole confused, frightened tale of it from Comfort's own lips. I did not plan it, Inspector. I want that understood. I went to her that night, meaning only to talk to her, to explain, to beg her silence a little longer, and she was so frightened, so very frightened of me, once she understood I knew what she'd found, that I... She stopped again, and this time did not go on, and did not need to. She was taken away a little later, quietly, by the front door rather than any other, with no more ceremony than a coat fetched and a car brought round, and Endymion, white and shaking and entirely uncomprehending, was left with Sylvie's arms about him in the hall, and Miss Marple thought, watching them, that there was a very great deal of grief still to come in that house, of a kind no fire could burn away and no grate ever quite conceal. Miss Marple stayed on at Farrant Grange rather longer than she had originally intended, a few days only, but days that seemed, in the quiet, subdued aftermath, considerably longer than the fortnight that had preceded them. And it was on the morning before her departure, with her case packed and the London train not due until the afternoon, that Sylvie asked rather shyly whether Miss Marple would care to walk with her to the churchyard. It was a soft, still morning. The fog lifted at last, with a pale, watery sun doing its modest best over the cold harbour hills, and the two of them walked the short distance from the Grange without a great deal of talk, until they came to stand together before a plain headstone, newly cut, that gave no more of Comfort Hatch's long, quiet, self-effacing life than her name, and her dates, and the single word, beloved, which Miss Marple thought, standing there, was very possibly the first time in 20 years that anyone had troubled to say so of her, without immediately asking her to fetch something. "I still don't properly understand it all," said Sylvie after a while. "Why she never simply asked. Why she wrote to you, so far away, and hardly known to her any more, instead of speaking plainly to anyone in the house. Because she had learned, I think, a very long time ago, not to make a fuss," said Miss Marple gently. "It is not always a kindness, teaching a person that. Comfort was a frightened little girl at school, who apologised for wasps stinging her, and she grew, I am sorry to say, into a frightened old woman who apologised for being murdered, very nearly, by writing to me as though it were her own foolishness she was troubled by, rather than anyone else's wickedness. I have thought, these last few days, that if I had been a little quicker to hear what she was truly telling me, if I had gone to her the very first night, instead of waiting for a private moment that was never going to be allowed to come, I might have heard the whole of it in time to save her. You couldn't have known. No, Miss Marple agreed. I couldn't have known. But I knew enough to be uneasy, and I let a cushion and a fire and a great deal of gracious hospitality persuade me that my unease could wait until morning. I don't think I shall forget that in a hurry, my dear, and I don't think I ought to. She was quiet for a moment, looking down at the small plain grave. She wrote to me because I was the one person left in the world she remembered as sensible, from a time before she had learned to be afraid of her own opinions. I have thought about that a great deal too. It is not a small thing to be the person someone remembers as sensible across 40 years and a great deal of silence. I hope I may prove worth remembering the next time someone needs to write such a letter. Sylvie